Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, each year we have a debate on the Defense Authorization Act. And in the past, it was a real debate, a debate in which people brought significant issues to the floor related to American national security. Their amendments were considered. We argued pro and con. We took votes. We lobbied our colleagues within our caucus or across the aisle for the wisdom of our viewpoint. And that is a tradition, that is a practice, that is what this chamber is all about. To take on the issues that we face as a nation, wrestle with them, explore the pros and cons, find the strength or weakness, sometimes come to compromises that take several viewpoints and merge them together into an even stronger point of view. But I'm deeply disturbed that the U.S. Senate is quickly losing that ability to consider the issues facing our nation. My colleague just spoke to the challenge of climate pollution, and I appreciate him doing so. But we've had few determined efforts to address the ideas different members have for taking on that challenge, despite its devastation to so many ways in different parts of our country. And when it comes to the security of our country, no issue is more important than the question of going to war. Our founders realized this is a decision that should never be vested in a single person, not even the president. They knew that a single individual might find political cause or corrupt purposes to make a decision to go to combat against a force, that such a decision should be debated in a chamber like this and in a chamber like the House. That is why the Constitution gives to this body, the legislature of the United States of America, the power to go to war. It's a question that came up early in our history. There was a challenge that we had off the Barbary Coast with corsairs, or often referred to as pirates, taking charge of American brigs and holding them hostage. And Jefferson embraced the idea of going to war, became president in 1801. Alexander Hamilton wanted to remind him what the Constitution said. And as he said, quote, "It belongs to Congress only to go to war." Any one of us should be able to pull out our pocket constitutions, read Article 1, Section 8, that deliberate delegation to this chamber and the House to make that decision. Well, right now we're hearing the drumbeat of war with Iran. There's been a lot of animosity between our two countries for a long period of time. The United States mounted a campaign through the Central Intelligence Agency to take out the directly elected leadership of Iran in 1953, a CIA-staged coup, and to install a leader, the Shah of Iran, who operated with great, shall I say, violence against the people, had a secret police that was as feared as any in the world. There were other points of animosity when the people of Iran rose up against that Shah and took hostage Americans and kept them hostage for a great length of time during the Carter administration and didn't release them until President Reagan came into office. And then there was the Iraq-Iran War, a war in which hundreds of thousands of people in Iran died, and the United States assisted the Iraqis in that war against Iran. Well, we have had often no love lost between our two nations over this period of time. And I mention these few points of history to say that each side nurtures its grievances against the other. But something remarkable happened under the last administration. They worked to coordinate pressure from the entire world to strike a deal with Iran, to end their nuclear program, and the risk of Iran becoming a nuclear power. This agreement was something bought into by Russia and China, the European powers, the United States. And they did many concrete things that their right wing did not like, dismantling their plutonium reactor, shipping enriched uranium out of their country, shutting down their centrifuges, allowing a massive amount of inspectors into their country to watch everything that they were doing. And in return, the deal was that we would help them economically, find a better standard of living. This was a moment of potential turning point in the relationship, this long animosity between the two countries, potentially a win-win. But then comes in a new administration, the Trump administration, and they don't like this possibility, this deal. The president said it's the worst deal ever struck. And we, the United States, pull out of the deal. May 8th, 2018, just over a year ago. And since then, we've heard the drum beats of war echoing here on Capitol Hill. The administration designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, and then proceeding to tighten the economic sanctions in order to pressure the economy of Iran. And so we had the end of the waivers for partners of ours to be able to buy Iranian oil, greatly starving the economy of that nation. And then we deployed in recent weeks the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Force to the Gulf. And then we deployed a B-52 squadron to the Gulf. And then we heard the advocates in the administration saying, if anything happens with a connection with Iran, we will show them the ferocity of our forces. We will respond and show them not to mess with the United States of America. And different officials cited different examples, but one was if an Iranian militia in Iraq should happen to harm an American, that could be a trigger. Or if Iran was to disrupt the movement of oil through the Gulf, that could be a trigger. When you deploy forces and then start looking for triggers, you can find one if you want for war. But I stand here today to quote the Constitution of the United States of America. And that Constitution says the power of war rests with this body, not the Oval Office. As we've pressured Iran, we've had incidents occur that have been highlighted in recent days. Some mines were put on the side of a couple ships, blew a hole through the side, didn't sink the ships. Administration is pretty sure, they say, that Iran did this. Well, I always exercise some caution. We all remember the Iraq War. We remember that the administration then, the Bush administration, built what they said was a powerful case of weapons of mass destruction being cultivated by Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government. And we went to war on that evidence, and we were wrong. But here we are at this moment, an administration that has pre-deployed forces, is squeezing the Iranian people as powerfully as possible. What happens in this situation? What is the goal? Now, some of the administrations say the goal is negotiations. Now, let me get this straight. The United States broke the deal in strengthening the far right in Iran, which said, don't trust the Americans. We strengthened the Revolutionary Guard because the Revolutionary Guard didn't like the deal to begin with. Then we've economically squeezed the people of Iran, creating great hardship throughout the land, meaning we have moved the entire population in the direction of supporting the far right in that country. Now, take these two things. We have strengthened not the moderates who want to see the nation on a different course, but the far right. And then we've alienated much of the country and increased our support for the far right. And we have shown that when we sign a deal, we don't stand behind the deal because this administration broke the deal. How is that a foundation for negotiation? We're saying to Iran, we negotiated, you agreed, but we're breaking the deal, and now we want to negotiate again. People don't tend to want to negotiate with folks who have broken the previous deal. So we here see that we have a challenge in which we stand on the precipice of potential war. And my colleague from New Mexico has an amendment that restates the fundamentals of our Constitution. And he has teamed up with my colleague from Virginia, who is here on the floor as well. And I'm certainly completely supportive of their effort. They are saying that while we are on this bill on security, on defense authorization, this is the moment we should be debating whether or not the president has the authority to go to war. And their amendment says, no, he does not. He must follow the Constitution, and he must come to this body for authorization. That is an important message for us to send. We must not leave the debate on defense authorization without debating the Udall-Kane amendment. My colleagues are here to speak to it in greater detail. I so much appreciate their work. This is a moment that this chamber must rise to the challenge of being a force that can wrestle with great issues before us, and there is no more important security issue at this moment than debating whether or not the president has the power to go to war. I stand with the Constitution. I hope my colleagues will all stand with the Constitution in this chamber. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I also rise today with my colleagues to talk about the rumors of war that we have been hearing in this body and in the news. And I want to advocate for a very simple amendment whose timing is, I think, propitious. As we discuss the National Defense Authorizing Act, why wouldn't we discuss what we're hearing from the White House and others? Why wouldn't we discuss the events that are happening on the ground in the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East? The amendment that Senator Udall has prepared, that is a bipartisan amendment that's before the body, and we hope for a vote early next week, is a straightforward one. No funds would be used to prosecute a war against Iran unless this Congress has a vote to authorize it, to authorize such a war. As my colleague from Oregon mentioned, that's what the Constitution suggests, and that's the debate that we should be having. Part of the reason I feel so strongly about this is because I'm a Virginian. We are the most connected state to the military mission of the United States. All states are connected and all states are patriotic. But if you just add up the kind of per capita in Virginia, our active duty, our Guard, our Reserve, our DOD civilians like the nurses who work at the Fort Belvoir Hospital, the DOD contractors like the shipbuilders and Newport News, our military families. We are the most connected to the nation's military mission. I am personally connected in this with the son and the United States Marines. And so as a Virginian, I feel very strongly about this, and I also feel strongly about it because we're proud of the Virginians, Madison and Jefferson and others, who were among the founders who crafted the Constitution. They tried to do some things that were pretty revolutionary then and that are still revolutionary. Some of our Constitution was a great borrowing exercise, taking wonderful ideas from other constitutions and laws and assembling them together in the wonderful document they put together in 1787. But there were a couple of ideas in the Constitution of 1787 that were not chosen from elsewhere, that were really unique to our country and are still unique. And one of the unique ideas is this, that war is not a matter for the executive, the king, the emperor, the monarch, the sultan, the pope. No, war is a matter that needs to be declared by the people's elected legislative body. That was revolutionary in 1787, and it's revolutionary today. The balance of power that was struck was that Congress would declare war, and then once declared, there would only be one commander-in-chief. 535 commanders-in-chief would be a disaster. The decision to initiate war would be for Congress, and then the president, working in tandem with military leadership, would be the commander-in-chief to prosecute a war once declared. But there should be no shortcut and no substitute for the debate in this body before the initiation of war. The amendment that will be on the table and that hopefully we'll receive a vote on, that is bipartisan nature, would prevent funding for any war against Iran unless there is a vote of Congress to authorize such a war. The amendment does make clear that, that no previous congressional act, for example, the 2001 authorization, can be tortured and twisted and stretched and bootstrapped into a declaration of war against Iran. The administration has sort of been trying to lay that as a predicate, suggesting that an authorization that passed in 2001 that did not mention Iran would authorize war against Iran, when not a single person who voted for it in 2001 ever thought it was to be used in justification for war against Iran. The administration would like to try to use that as a justification, they've said in testimony here on the Hill. Think about this. If they're so afraid to come to Congress and ask for an authorization that they want to try to use something from 18 years ago, what does it tell us about their confidence that they have a good justification that we need to be in a war? The amendment that we have does not prevent the U.S. from defending themselves from attack against Iran. The President has the power as Commander-in-Chief under Article 2, and the War Powers Resolution specifies that power and doesn't codify it. It doesn't need to be codified, but makes clear that that power is always inherent in the office of the President. Our amendment doesn't suggest that Iran's behavior is acceptable or consistent with international norms. I have been part of many efforts over the course of my time in the Senate to impose sanctions on Iran if they violated, for example, ballistic missile protocols, UN sanctions or rules, if they've engaged in human rights abuses. The purpose here is not to stand up and defend Iranian behavior, but it is to stand for the proposition that we shouldn't be committed to a war without a vote of Congress. And I will say that this administration's actions and rhetoric have been unnecessarily provocative. It was the U.S. that pulled out of a diplomatic deal that was working, not Iran. When President Trump pulled out of the diplomatic deal, at the time he did, his then Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, his then Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, his then National Security Advisor, General McMaster, his then and current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, all said that the Iran deal was working, that Iran was complying with it, the United States should stay in it. The President pulled out of the diplomatic deal nevertheless, and in the year since has reimposed sanctions and taken a number of steps that are provocative towards Iran. Diplomatic provocation, rhetorical provocation, economic provocation, and military provocation. We've been having a set of briefings, some classified, from the administration on this. I'm not going to get into classified material, but one thing I will acknowledge, and I'm impressed by this, the administration's intel experts, when they brief us on the situation, even yesterday, they will state that Iran's activities are, and this is pretty much a direct quote, in response to the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. The U.S. maximum pressure campaign that started with the U.S. backing out of a diplomatic deal is leading to Iran taking other actions that we don't like, but they're not taking those actions unprovoked. Their actions need to be understood as a response to the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. Senator Merkley talked about us. We pulled out of the deal. We've reimposed sanctions. We've designated part of the Iranian government as a foreign terrorist organization. We've misrepresented routine military operations in the region. We've moved more troops and Patriot missiles and aircraft carriers and other material, military material, into Iran's region. This is not them moving material into our region. It's us moving material into their neighborhood. Just this week, the administration announced the deployment of additional 1,000 troops to the Middle East to counter Iran, and that's what this administration is doing, a maximum pressure campaign that tears up diplomacy and thus raises the risk of unnecessary war. I will also point out, it's not just U.S. activity that is provoking Iran. When the U.S. allows Saudi Arabia to get missiles that they shouldn't have, when the U.S. observes the Saudis building a missile program by public reports, possibly with the support of China, that is viewed as very dangerous by Iran. When the U.S. transfers nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, not even briefing Congress about it, and the Saudis say that they would try to build up a nuclear arsenal to counter Iran, it's a provocation. So the maximum pressure by the United States and nations like Saudi Arabia are leading to an unnecessary escalation of tension in the region. I want to conclude, because my colleague from New Mexico, who is the author of this, also wants to speak about why we need to take it up. But let me just say this. I'm going to state for the record my position. I think another war in the Middle East now would be a disaster. I think it would be catastrophic for the U.S. to tear up a diplomatic deal and then look at our troops in the face and say, because we tore up a diplomatic deal, you have to now go fight another war when we've been in the Middle East for 18 years. I think it would represent just about as catastrophic a failure of American foreign policy as you could imagine. I think it would also have the disadvantage of taking our eye off the ball. I've always been taught to keep the main thing the main thing. I think the main thing right now in national security for the United States is to keep our eye on our principal competitor, which is China. When we take our eye off our principal competitor and we engage in wars that we needn't be in, China will be the victor in that. That is a very dangerous thing for us. And so I think that it would be catastrophic for the United States to be engaged in another war in the Middle East, particularly a war against Iran right now. But if the president feels differently about that, if some of his advisors think we ought to be about regime change in Iran, as they've said, if some of them think it would be easy to beat Iran in a war, as they've said, if some colleagues here on the floor think we should be in a war with Iran, as some have publicly urged, let them come to the floor of the United States Senate in full view of the American people and make that argument. Let's have that argument right here in the greatest deliberative body in the world with the American public watching. And I'll make my argument about why a new war in the Middle East would be catastrophic and see who wants to stand up and make the argument that a new war in the Middle East is something that this great nation should do. And if we then have that argument and cast a vote and I lose, I'm going to be disappointed, but we will have done what the Constitution suggests that we must do. Our failure to have that debate is so unfair to our troops. It's unfair to our troops to put them in harm's way with Congress hiding under their desk, not being willing to state yay or nay about whether we should be engaged in hostilities. Let's honor the troops and the sacrifice we would ask them to make, follow the Constitution, and have this debate before the American public. And that's what the amendment would essentially guarantee that this body would do, and that's why I so strongly support it. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition. And let me thank the two senators that preceded me here. Senator Merkley spoke on this issue of whether we should be going to another war in the Middle East. And Senator Kaine, who I've watched since he's been in the Senate, has been relentless and very consistent about raising the issues of authorizations of force and relying on authorizations of force from 2001, 2002, very what we consider outdated in terms of looking at the facts on the ground. So I know he's been working hard, Senator Kaine has, in the Armed Services Committee. Both of us have been working in the Foreign Relations Committee to try to address this constitutional issue that is really before us. I came to the floor of the Senate 4 weeks ago warning that this administration's reckless escalation of tensions with Iran was blindly leading us to the brink of war. I urge this body to assert its constitutional authority and pass my bipartisan legislation, the Prevention of Unconstitutional War with Iran Act. I called on all of us, Republicans and Democrats, to make it clear that the President alone cannot wage war against Iran without authorization from Congress. Well, here we are, 1 month later. Tensions with Iran have only increased. The threat of conflict has only drawn closer. Today we woke up to the news that Iranian forces shot down a U.S. drone. That comes on the heels of 1,000 American troops being sent to the Middle East. And yet the Senate does nothing. Nothing to assert Congress's constitutional authority. Nothing to assume the responsibility that the founders clearly placed on our shoulders, the people's representatives. The Republican leadership should not duck all debate on a military conflict with Iran. We need to vote. We owe it to our men and women in uniform whose lives would be put on the line and to have this debate, to make the hard choices and to take the tough votes. Today, Mr. President, we're calling for a vote on an amendment to the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. The amendment prohibits funding for military operations against Iran without explicit authorization from Congress. I'm joined in this amendment by Senators Kaine, Durbin, Paul, Merkley, and Murphy. My related bill has 25 co-sponsors and still counting. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution couldn't be clearer. It is Congress and Congress alone that has the authority to declare war. This amendment, recognizing Congress's clear-cut authority, should have broad bipartisan support. Whether you support armed conflict with Iran or believe that the war would be a disaster, you should have the courage to cast a vote when the Constitution says it's your job. And let's be clear, this bill does not tie our armed forces' hands. Our military is highly capable, and we have an inherent right of self-defense, which this amendment clearly underscores. But we need to step up. The situation is more urgent day by day. The President and Secretary of State have accused Iran of being responsible for the attack on 2 oil tankers last week. Iran has denied that involvement. There is a somewhat conflicting report from the Japanese tanker owner. I do not know whether Iran, its surrogates, or another party is responsible for this heinous action, but this administration's itch to go to war is all too reminiscent of how we got embroiled in Iraq in 2003 and how the disastrous tanker war of the 1980s began. We must not make the same terrible mistakes again. We do need to find out precisely what happened and who is responsible, but the response need not be another endless war in the Middle East. We need a thorough and objective investigation of this incident, as has been called for by a number of nations. And the senators need a real intelligence briefing that covers sources and evidence, not just a statement of opinions from administration officials. If the Trump administration is entering our forces into hostilities, then this Congress should demand that a report be submitted to Congress in accordance with the War Powers Act. Those who wrote that act made it clear, hostilities, and I quote here, hostilities also encompasses a state of confrontation in which no shots have been fired, but denotes a situation in which there is a clear potential either for such a state of confrontation or for actual armed conflict, end quote. We may have already crossed this threshold. Some have said we have. The Reagan administration failed to submit such a report to Congress during the tanker wars, and the Congress failed to hold that administration accountable, despite the overwhelming evidence of hostilities. Now the current administration has hinted that it does not need to go to Congress for approval for hostilities against Iran. They seem to believe that the 9/11 AUMF gives them legal authority for war. Many of us in Congress today voted for that AUMF, including myself. And let me be clear, no one who voted for it thought that it would be used to justify a war against Iran 18 years later. But Congress needs to make that clear before it's too late. Yes, the Strait of Hormuz, Persian Gulf, and Gulf of Oman should be safe for navigation. Vital interests are at stake. But I agree with the statement issued by the U.S. Central Command in the aftermath of this recent attack, and I quote here, we have no interest in engaging in a new conflict in the Middle East. We will defend our interest, but a war with Iran is not in our strategic interest, nor in the best interest of the international community, end quote. That's the U.S. Central Command. A war with Iran is not in our strategic interest. And a majority of Americans agree. The American people are tired of forever wars in the Middle East that take our resources, produce no strategic gains, and most tragically endanger the lives of American men and women. And in any war with Iran, we will have few allies to back us. The international community is not behind the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State's bellicose rhetoric. We would have to go it nearly alone. The administration's maximum pressure strategy is supposedly intended to bring Iran to the negotiating table. But this strategy has predictably failed to produce any negotiations or make any diplomatic inroads. Instead, it is emboldening the hardliners in Tehran who also want confrontation. The administration pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement was a colossal strategic blunder. It was supposedly intended to get the U.S. a better deal, but violating our obligations has only produced saber-rattling, brinkmanship, and the very real risk that a miscalculation or mistake will result in an all-out war. The U.S. and the world were safer with the Iran nuclear agreement. It included strict verification requirements. The International Atomic Energy and the President's own intelligence and defense teams agreed Iran was complying. The unilateral withdrawal only undermined relations with our allies, signaled that the U.S. will not keep its word, and destabilize the Middle East even more. This was a predictable result, and many warned the Trump administration about this outcome. Iran now threatens to exceed the agreement's limits on nuclear fuel within days. While I hope Iran holds to its end of the bargain, the U.S. pulling out of the agreement and reimposing sanctions has opened the door for Iran to walk away as well. Now we must do all we can over the next 17 months to make sure this president does not precipitously start a war with Iran, a country of 80 million people, about 4 times the size of Iraq, and with proxy forces throughout the region, war that would cost trillions of dollars and undoubtedly American lives. With each passing day and with each incident, the risk of a catastrophic war grows closer. I realize some of my colleagues have a different view of the situation. Some talk about how all options must be on the table, or say that the Iranian regime must be overthrown. I hope they reconsider and change their minds. But if they don't, then they should at least have the courage of their convictions. If you want to empower this president to fight a war with Iran, let's vote on that question. The American people, and not least our men and women in uniform, deserve to know that their representatives will debate, discuss, and vote on these most difficult of decisions. And that is why all of us in this body must demand that this amendment be heard, debated, and voted on. Senate gridlock cannot be an excuse. The Constitution puts this decision squarely in our court. It is long past time for Congress to reassert its war power authority. Our oath demands that we make any decision to go to war. The real possibility that this administration will precipitate conflict in Iran requires us to face this question now. And the fact that American lives will be on the line places the moral imperative on us to debate this issue and to make clear to the President and his administration that any decision to go to war with Iran must be made by Congress. Mr. President, I yield the floor.